Hello, this is Matthew with Copley Financial Group, and today we're going to do a market update. I know it's been a little while since I put one out. We've been going around here with our hair on fire, doing Roth conversions and all kinds of tax reduction strategies this time of the year. But I did want to get a market update out just because we've seen a lot of volatility in the market. Big up days, Dow's down 500, Dow's up 500. And so I wanted to let you know kind of what's going on and what we're seeing out there in the stock market and the economy. So a couple competing factors. One is a slowdown and the other one is inflation. And so on the slowdown side, it does look like we potentially are going into a recession. We are seeing a slowdown in the data. The charts are telling us that there's a slowdown. There's a lot of factors that play into this slowdown. For example, the traffic during Black Friday and the holiday sales, even though it was substantially higher than it was in 2020 during the pandemic, it's still about 25% lower than it was in 2019, which is going to show some pretty pathetic sales numbers coming into next month when they start looking at the data. So the market's looking at that and saying, uh-oh, we're starting to see a slowdown. Some of the other things that I'm watching is we have a record number of insider sales. The numbers are really huge. Over $70 billion now have been sold insider, in people that are inside the companies. This is Elon Musk selling the Tesla shares. This is the Walton family selling Walmart shares. So just a record number, and it's over 70% higher than it normally is in any given year. Some of this may be that they're worried about taxes going up with Biden's proposals next year. So there may be a lot of selling to take advantage of the lower potential tax brackets this year versus next year. But generally, you see these large sales by insiders at times when the market is reaching highs, when it's reaching peaks, and these insiders start to see a slowdown within their own company. And so when you see this across the board, lots of selling going on, typically that tells that there is some slowdown that these insiders are seeing within their companies. And the data is letting us know this as well. Also, if you look at the bond market, especially the long maturity bonds, we're starting to see what looks like a slowdown as well. All stuff that says the economy is going to go into a recession, that we're going to see a slowdown, interest rates coming down, so on and so forth. So we want to be very cautious and make sure that we're not going to take a big hit if the stock market has a big drop or the economy goes into a recession. So obviously we've hedged a lot of the positions to protect the accounts in that scenario. But the flip side of that is inflation is a lot worse than they're making out. And if you've seen my videos in the past, you know I've been predicting that inflation is going to be a lot worse than they're telling us. And we're starting to see that now in the data. And they're finally starting to admit that the inflation is a lot worse. Just recently, the Federal Reserve Chairman admitted that we need to retire the word transitory because it is not transitory, it is permanent. And we're seeing this in a lot of the data. The current CPI is up about 6% year over year, and that's the consumer price index. But I also look a little deeper than the consumer price. You also want to look at the producer price index. And the PPI is actually up 9% year over year. And we're not even seeing all the inflation being passed through. The idea is these companies, they don't want to raise their prices until their competitors do. They don't want to be the first company to raise prices. So they wait for their competitor, right? Macy's doesn't want to raise prices until Nordstrom's and the other companies do as well. And so you want to make sure that you understand that the producer price index is the real increase in inflation. And we see this individually as well. You're seeing it, for example, beef prices. If you look at beef prices, they're up 20% year over year on the CPI. But they're up 33% in the PPI. So that's a sizable increase. And we're seeing this just I noticed at the local taco shop here in Mission Valley that we go to, carne asada burritos, which were $7 and something a year ago, are $10 now. That's $10 for one burrito. That's Roberto's over by Hazard Center. That's $10 for one burrito. So we're starting to see this obviously in a lot of the numbers with inflation. And I do think inflation is going to get a lot worse. And I want you to understand what's going on and why this is happening. You have to think of the economy as all of the goods and services, all of the things that we produce. So if you have a guy that grows potatoes in Idaho, and you have someone who manufactures widgets in their factory, and you have someone who works on automobiles, and you have a guy who's a brain surgeon who went to school for 8 years, when those people produce something or they provide a service, they get paid. And we pay them in money. But what that money represents is really a claim check. That money is a claim on their service or their production. So if a guy makes a sandwich at the deli, he gets paid for his work putting that sandwich together and paying for his cost to run the deli. And if a guy fixes a transmission at the mechanic shop, he's getting paid for his service and his time to fix the transmission. So if the guy at the mechanic shop gets paid a claim check for his service and he goes down to the deli and wants to buy a sandwich, he takes some of his production that he got paid for and uses it to buy a sandwich. So this is where this person's producing something, they get a claim check, and this person's producing something, they get a claim check. But unfortunately, when you make a lot of claim checks out of thin air, you can't make sandwiches out of thin air. You can't make someone fixing a transmission, a mechanic, out of thin air. You can't make a brain surgeon out of thin air. So essentially what happens is you have these extra claim checks and you have the same number of goods and services, and this is going to do two things. It's going to create shortages, number one, so you're going to have more money demanding services and goods that aren't there, and then it's going to cause prices to go up. So inflation is not rising prices. The inflation's already here. We've already done the inflation, and the rising prices is a consequence. It's a symptom of the inflation. The supply chain is a symptom of the inflation. So I think this is going to get a lot worse. And the reason I think this is going to get a lot worse is we now have record amounts of cash on the sidelines because the consumer has been very nervous about the economy and politics and everything else. There's a lot of cash in bank accounts. There's a lot of cash in the sidelines. In fact, there's a record amount of cash sitting there. And when that cash gets deployed, you're going to see a lot more inflation. Even in the face of a recession, potentially, there's going to be a lot of inflation. And when you start thinking about what can happen, it's like musical chairs. You don't want to be the person that doesn't have a chair when the music stops. When people start to realize it's a really bad idea to have a lot of cash in the bank. And what I'm seeing, one client after another, 100,000, 150,000, 200,000 cash in the bank. When people realize this is a really bad idea to be getting 0.5% interest when inflation officially is at 6% on the CPI and 9% on the PPI, what's going to happen is they're going to use that money to buy something. Now, that might be an asset like a stock market investment, maybe real estate, maybe fine wine, fine art, baseball cards, a 1968 Mustang, something of value. That money is going to get deployed. It's going to cause inflation. And when people start to realize, cash is a hot potato, I don't want to hold on to it because it's slowly going down in value, what happens is the velocity of money will pick up and that inflation will get a lot worse because people won't want to hold cash. Right now, it's a crazy amount of people hoarding cash, and that is going to change here shortly once people realize that's a bad idea. So when you combine all the data that says, hey, we may be going into a slowdown, and a lot of the stocks are at extremely high valuations. These are the Amazons, the Facebooks, the Teslas, the Netflix. These companies with very high valuations, their stock price is going to come down. And we're already seeing this in some of the smaller companies. There was a lot of companies during the pandemic that did really, really well during the shutdown. One of those was the Zoom. Everyone went on the Zoom calls. And of course, Zoom stock price went right up, zoomed up. And we've seen now that the stock price of Zoom has now crashed 70% from the high. And that's because they don't have the revenue to back up these extremely high valuations. And we're going to see that across the board on a lot of these large companies. And unfortunately, right now, the S&P 500 should be called the S&P 7 because the top 7 companies represent 35% of the entire stock market. And so we want to be very careful. Right now, you want to position all the investments into high quality blue chip value stocks, good valuation, good dividends, good cash flow, good balance sheet, low debt. And we also at the same time want to understand that there's a potential with all this inflation coming that the prices of everything can go up, including stocks. And so we don't want to hold cash. And so this is an interesting time. It may be very similar to what we saw in the 1970s when they coined the word stagflation. This is where you had a recession at the same time you had the consumer prices and the inflation going up. And so we want to make sure we're positioned to both take advantage of a potential downturn in the market. So we do want to have some cash on the sidelines to buy back in if the market does have a temporary downturn. But we also want to be very aware that the inflation is going to push up asset prices on everything from stocks to real estate to baseball cards to fine wine to fine art to classic automobiles. So just keep that in mind when we're positioning the investments. And we've got some great ways to do that. Obviously, the buffered index has worked fantastic. Everyone that's in that, we've made some great returns. And it's a way that we can invest in the stock market, but have some insurance. So if the market drops, we get reimbursed for a large chunk of our losses. And so that's a great way to do it. Obviously, the annuities have been a good way to protect yourself from stock market drop. And today we do have a fixed annuity that I like a lot. It's a guaranteed 3.05% for the next 5 years. It's just a fixed. It's not an index. It's just a flat amount. And that's certainly a lot better than making 0.5% in the bank. Not quite what we want to get with inflation running at 6%. But that is an option to kind of get out of the stock market, get out of the way. And at the same time, give us at least try to keep up. And then, of course, there's a lot of other stuff that we want to take a look at, alternatives, what goes up in an inflationary environment, agriculture, basic materials, and precious metals, which has really lagged, surprisingly, with all the inflation we're seeing. I'm surprised that precious metals really has not started to move up any more than it has. But it's just getting started. We saw this in the mid-70s. It was interesting. You saw the price of gold kind of spike up and then come back down in the mid-70s. And it was kind of surprising. All this inflation is going on. Why isn't the price of gold going up? And the market figured it out real quick, and the price of gold just skyrocketed in the late 70s. And we went from price of gold at $35 an ounce at the beginning of the 1970s up to $800 an ounce at the end of the 1970s. So that's a possibility. And when you see that kind of inflation, along with potential recession slowdown, this is the kind of result that we could see. So we want to keep doing our balanced, diversified portfolio. We'll be happy to chat with you about your individual holdings. If you want to come in and see us, we'll be happy to go over that with you, or we can do a Zoom meeting or a phone call. So thank you for allowing me to give you a little market update on what's going on. And if I don't do another one of these before the holidays, happy holidays and have a nice new year.